Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me on this lovely Tuesday afternoon here. We should have a great show ahead, starting off by recapping that crazy, hectic Monday Night Football game last night between the Browns and the Broncos in the Mile High City. Then we're going to be taking a little bit of a look into the waiver wire. Still some guys who might be important additions to your squad, whether you're fighting to get into the playoffs or just want to bolster your squad ahead of a nice little deep fantasy football playoff run. Continuing my positional rankings with the wide receivers and tight ends today, and then concluding with my fantasy fact versus fiction segment, justifying and debunking some of the fantasy myths of the week that you might want to monitor. But as always, before we get into today's show, I do want to remind you that if you want to view more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network. There are so many different nice little shows that you can look into on our network, all things sports here at GSMC. It's greatly appreciated in advance if you so choose. But if you want to interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as Andre's doing a great example of that. Been a long time since he's been in the chat. Thank you for your return. I hope you have some nice comments for me today, my man, as well. But it's a great way to contribute and interact with the show. As always, make sure that if you want your opinions heard, that you put them in the comments section. I love reading them out. Anything from fantasy advice, trade advice even, or just general football talk, I'm all for it, and it's greatly appreciated. Just makes the show that much better. But let's get right into our first segment, trying to make sense of a very crazy Monday Night Football game that occurred in the Mile High City last night. Let's talk about that Browns-Broncos game. It was a nice win for the Broncos, 41-32, 8-5 heading into their bye week, and a little bit of rest to get prepared for the home stretch of the season, potentially trying to sneak in as that last wild card in the AFC, but not necessarily the best example of what this defense can do. Absolutely shredded by a Browns offense that, yes, has one of the most Jekyll and Hyde quarterbacks at the position, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But as far as that defense was concerned, this was a very interesting performance, to say the least. A very bizarre performance for a defense that had been performing so well. However, on a night when the defense wasn't performing as well, it was the timely, opportunistic plays that made the difference in one. 2 pick sixes here that really made the difference in this one for Denver. On the fantasy side of things, it was a very exciting game, very historic game for the losing team, but for the Denver Broncos, not necessarily the best from a fantasy perspective. In fact, you can say that they should not have won this game despite the fact that their defense was so timely, just because their offense really didn't do many things. Besides that one long touchdown pass from Bo Nix to Marvin Mims, and we'll talk about that later, there really weren't many explosive plays like we're used to seeing this past couple of weeks in that Broncos offense with Bo Nix and his connection to Sean Payton's system now. But as always, it was a very nice way to end the football week here. And let's get right into what made it so special from a fantasy perspective, even though the losing team had much more historic performances all around than the winning team. So let's start off with the losing team in Cleveland. Jameis Winston. What a treasure he is to the National Football League, to the world in general. He is just an incredible kind of motivator, and no matter what happens throughout his career, he'll always be one of the more inspired players, or inspiring players rather, in the National Football League, no matter where he goes. But on this night, he proved that as much as he can help your team, he can also hurt it in big ways as well. He has his peaks and valleys, and even though he's a very exciting fantasy prospect, you have to understand, you're going to let a lot of goods with a lot of bads as well, though. 34 of 58, 497 yards, 4 TDs were the good. A historic performance. That's the day. If you add in the interception return yards, which is funny to do, he would have a 668 passing yards, would be the most in NFL history if you included those interception returns. As Andre says, famous Jameis was playing out of his mind. He was playing out of his mind both ways, my man. Because let's talk about the bad now. The bad is 3 interceptions. And he's in pretty ignominious company in terms of players who have had games like this in the past. In fact, not since Kyle Orton, remember him, has there been a player who's thrown for over 400 plus yards and had 2 pick sixes in a game. And not since Brett Favre have there been players who have had multiple picks in this game as well. But he still had a very nice fantasy day, so you can't complain if you picked him up. 32.98 fantasy points, and thus a pretty stellar fantasy performance. A historic one, but didn't get the win just because, well, he is Jameis Winston at the end of the day, and that's what you get with him. Let's talk about the other historic performances. Andre also said, man, is he the crazy stat the Broncos haven't had a running back touch 100 yards in like 29 games or something wild? I actually did not see that, but their running attack, I was shocked, didn't show up today, or yesterday. They didn't necessarily get any ground game going, and it really hurt the explosiveness that this offense was able to employ these past couple of weeks. Without that run game, Bo Nix really doesn't have much opportunities downfield open up for him. Even though there were short touchdown runs in this game for Denver, there really weren't any explosive plays, any chunk plays to get this offense in rhythm, and that's what I was shocked by. They didn't necessarily win because they were good on both sides of the football. They won because, well, Jameis Winston's Jameis Winston, and he'll throw in a couple of pick sixes along the way. So that's why I'm shocked at that stat, but not necessarily surprised in terms of how this game panned out. Let's talk about another historic performance, another historic stat from Jerry Jeudy, perhaps the fantasy star of the game because of the fact that, well, Jameis Winston had interceptions to his name. 9 receptions, 235 yards and 1 touchdown, 40.5 fantasy points. By far, perhaps one of, if not the best fantasy performances by a wide receiver this season. And like I said, in terms of historical standpoints here, 235 yards, the most receiver has had in his first game against his former team. On the road, he didn't get the win, although he said he really wanted to in this one to get revenge on the Browns. He really stepped up, and has really stepped up ever since Winston has become the quarterback there in Cleveland, and truly been one of the great receivers over these past couple of weeks. 889 yards now, when with Deshaun he was well under 200 or so. But right now, Jerry Jeudy's playing out of his mind football, and you might want to look into him for that fantasy football playoff push. And last but not least, let's talk about, to my chagrin, because he really hurt my fantasy football team last night, David Njoku. I was losing anyways, but this guy really put the nail in the coffin last night. 9 receptions, 52 yards, 2 touchdowns, 26.2 fantasy points. And I've been telling you that David Njoku is one of those guys who can get rolling at any different time. He's not someone who's been consistent throughout the season, but he's also had those performances that make you realize how good he can be at his best. And this was one of them. He was timely in terms of route running, in the red zone especially, and he is still a very special kind of player for this Cleveland Browns team. He may not be a Cleveland Brown in the coming years, but he still is someone that you have to look out for. Now let's go over to the Broncos side of things, even though it was not as exciting and historic as what the Browns were able to put together on the opposite side of the football. We still have to acknowledge the winning team here. And it wasn't a pretty win. It was a very, very ugly win for Denver because, as Andre said, how much FAAB is Guerrero worth? I have 60 left. I'm not sure what FAAB means, but I think that Guerrero is also worth a look at in terms of a waiver wire addition, which it seems like you might be considering because of the fact, both McCaffrey and Mason are on the IR, and because, the 49ers might look like more of a running team in these weeks ahead. I think that as much as they're going to want to pass the football, you're going to need to get the run game going consistently in order to relax your style of play, because I think it's getting a little bit too scattershot there in San Fran, and it's not going to look pretty if they don't have any consistent rushing attack going forward. So Guerrero's going to get a lot of touches, and thus a lot of fantasy football managers will be excited to see him potentially picked up off the waiver wire. And so that's why I feel like he could be effective. I'm not quite sure what you mean by FAAB, but if you are looking to pick him up off the waiver wire, then go right ahead because he's going to see a lot of touches in San Fran. Let's get back to the Broncos here because we have to talk about them, even though, like I said, not the prettiest of performances from them. Let's talk about Bo Nix. Definitely not his best performance. I don't necessarily think it hurts his Offensive Rookie of the Year campaign, but I do think that the performance was not something we were expecting out of him in this one, especially against the Browns defense that has struggled this year. 18 for 35, 294 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, 12.16 fantasy points. But he made the biggest play of the game, right? After the Browns had gone 3 and out to start in the third quarter, after they had brought it to within 4 at the end of the first half, he had the nice little pass to Marvin Mims, and that was the big difference in terms of offensive output from Denver there, because it got them ahead by 11, and the Browns had to play catch-up at that point. But overall, definitely not his best game. And then Marvin Mims was the star, at least on the offensive side of the football. Leading receiver, 3 receptions, 105 yards, that long touchdown pass, 19.9 fantasy points. But overall, a really inconsistent performance by the Denver Broncos on the opposite side of the football. The defense, like I said, if it weren't for all the points that Jameis was able to put up in the blown coverages, they would have had a nice game because of the pick sixes as well. But Jameis Winston, like I said, is Jameis Winston, so he's always bound to have crazy numbers no matter what. And so the Broncos have to live with that, but a win is a win for them. They're at 8-5, sitting pretty in that final wildcard spot in the AFC, and primed to make a decent run at it in the home stretch after their bye. But that's all I have to say with this game, and we're going to conclude this segment with Andre's final comment here. Free agent auction budget so I can spend more money than other people and win Guendo in the waivers if I bid the most. I do believe I actually heard about this before. I just was not necessarily familiar, kind of caught me by surprise in terms of different ways the waiver wire works. But I do feel like, it's worth betting on, right? Because Guendo is in a pretty prime position to be someone who's going to be a very important focal point for San Francisco. If they really want to make a run at this and really want to try to compete in the NFC West, you're going to have a balanced attack. Balanced attacks win football games. And even though you have the weapons in the pass game and Brock Purdy might want to open it up a little bit more, it all starts with the running game there in San Fran. So be my guest. Whatever way you have to get him, whether it be through regular waivers or whether it be through bidding on him, then do everything you got to do, man. Well, the perfect segue into my second segment of the day here, the waiver wire. Let's talk about it a little bit more because a lot of people are priming for that playoff push. We'll be right back after this short break to talk a little bit more about how you can make some decisions there.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day though, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show to consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can go to our website if you so choose as well and leave a tip or donation and a comment there as well, or just do it through YouTube's many great features. It's greatly appreciated in advance, and it just makes this show that much better. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment that Andre kind of set up on a plate for me to present to you guys. The waiver wire. Let's talk about it because it's becoming a much more of a vital topic in this home stretch. Whether you're making last-minute decisions about which players you want to have for that playoff push if you're in the middle of the pack, or you're sitting pretty at the top and you just want to bolster your squad, the waiver wire is going to be very important for you with these stretches. Now, in terms of the teams you might be having to look at and the players, respectively, you're going to have to diversify the way you look at different teams, right? Because it's not just good teams, elite teams, who have players who have been unsung heroes for their respective squads. It's the bad teams you might want to be looking at, because with all these injuries piling up for them, there's more chances for these players to get touches rather than elite teams who already have cemented players in depth, most importantly, at certain positions. It's these bad teams, right, that really are starting to become valuable ways to analyze different players because of the fact they're the ones in more dire situations and they have less to lose. Thus, these players play more freely because that's the way to A, prove themselves to their team, and B, make you happy in terms of picking them off the waiver wire. So we're going to talk about that, but Guerrero is another big one, right? Because Guerrero is now on a team, right, that's not necessarily in the most advantageous of positions in terms of playoff position, but still have a shot. And it's those teams as well who are kind of in the middle of the pack, maybe not the most playoff prepared, but still teams who could be fighting for a playoff spot down the stretch. And thus, a guy like Guerrero is definitely going to get a lot more touches depending on how this plays out for San Fran. But we'd have to talk about the bad teams if we really want to get into the weeds of finding hidden gems rather than guys we already have seen to some extent be unsung heroes for their teams. So now we're going to talk about some guys we may not have touched upon before. Let's start off with the quarterback position. And I didn't want to be too obvious, right? Because everyone's floating out Caleb Williams' name, maybe because, people have dropped him from their rosters mid-season because of his little decline in play, and now we're picking him up ever since the insertion of now interim head coach Thomas Brown as his quote-unquote OC, now head coach. But I did want to be a little less obvious, so I decided to go with a guy who should, for the most part, see out the season for Jacksonville, and Mac Jones. He had a pretty decent day against a pretty decent Texans defense and really kept that game closer than it should have been. I still think that, he's not necessarily someone you would want to put your faith in because of the fact he was used goods in New England after that first season there when he looked like he could be a potential competent, serviceable quarterback there in New England after the second season and all that fallout. He doesn't necessarily have the best resume in terms of a quarterback who can step into this kind of situation, but he still is someone I want to monitor because of the fact that this Jaguars team certainly now has a feel to it, not necessarily of wanting to let their head coach down, but in many ways wanting to play for themselves, right? It's not necessarily about the issues of the organization right now. It's about playing for pride and playing for yourself, because if Mac Jones does play well, say he plays out the rest of the season, he could end up getting a decent contract in a better situation. And that's why you have to look at these players, even if they're not the best of options, and still think about them in a positive light. And that's a perfect example of a player who is in a situation where, he's playing for a terrible team, but has a chance to prove himself. And that means a lot more to these kinds of players than, say, guys who are just stepping into superstars roles and are already on a team that's established itself as a contender. Whereas the Jags have nothing to play for but pride. And that's why Mac Jones could potentially be a decent player. And let's talk about the depth of one of those playoff contenders in Minnesota, because that is an interesting story to follow. Because when you look at Minnesota, right, you don't necessarily think of them as a deep team because of the fact that this emergence of Justin Jefferson as a superstar talent really kind of diminishes the other players they have there. But Jordan Addison is becoming a star. Jalen Naylor's been timely and opportunistic whenever he's been on the field. And TJ Hawkinson is back in the lineup, and we know what he can do. But there's a guy who I think can be really advantageous for the Vikings on the stretch in the red zone as they try and have a run at it in the NFC North and at the number 1 overall seed in the NFC. And that is Johnny Mundt. He's not necessarily the best of tight ends in terms of situational awareness, in terms of actual pass catching prowess, but he is someone who's a physical presence, especially in the red zone. That's why I love him so much. He may not get as many targets, right? Because of the fact the Vikings are a team that wants to spread the wealth around. He is someone who garners intrigue based off of his physicality. And we've seen these kind of backup tight ends around the league. I'm very familiar with a certain backup tight end by the name of A.J. Barner, who's been a surprise for the Seahawks because of the fact he's been catching passes when he's been seen as more of a blocking tight end. But I digress because I'm talking about Mundt here. Mundt is someone who is very much like Barner, but I think will have more opportunities down the stretch as the Vikings are going to be playing more and more physical teams where they have to match mano a mano. So Johnny Mundt, even though he's not an appealing option at first glance, you have to dig deeper into why he could potentially be a breakout star. Because now you know what the waiver wire market says about certain players and certain teams. But if you're looking at a contender, right, and you're looking at certain players who might step up for them, you have to look at them in more positive lights, but also in terms of situation. Because the Vikings are a team that you know are going to have to fight to achieve their goals for the rest of the season. So, how will they fight? They're going to have to use their physical players, and Johnny Mundt is one of them. I know it's going to be kind of complicated to justify certain things, and I know that me telling you about him kind of complicates the way you view now other players, perhaps. But he is someone who I'm intrigued by. He did have a touchdown catch in that game against Arizona. So he is someone who they can utilize to a much larger extent down the stretch in those tougher matchups, especially in that potential division-clinching one in Week 18 that I'm very much looking forward to against Detroit. And then the third guy I want to talk about, again, this is a guy who has probably not gotten as many opportunities as he deserved in this offense, but he is playing for one of the most historic offenses. The problem is his team is not going to be competing for a playoff spot, unfortunately. It is Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, I understand that he's not had the best of seasons. A lot of people were very hopeful about him, I believe, coming into this year, just because of the fact that he had a great end to his 23 season. But I do believe that, this is someone down the stretch who, in terms of playing for pride, speaks to me a lot because of his physicality and explosiveness combined. When I look at that Bengals running back room, it's definitely not the prettiest. And it's definitely not one that's going to stand out because of the receivers they have, right? So you're going to have to look at it in a way in which one of these guys wants this position more and wants to play for pride more than the other. And I think it's Chase Brown right now. Zach Moss has really proven he's not necessarily a starting type of guy or necessarily a competent backup for that matter. He's been kind of a disappointment ever since going there. And I feel like, for what it's worth, it makes more sense if you want to be a much more explosive offense to go with the guy who actually screams that. And that's what I view in a guy like Chase Brown. Definitely not the best of picks. Definitely not someone like a Tank Bigsby, perhaps, or an Isaiah Pacheco, or someone of that nature, or a Rico Dowdle even, for that matter. But Chase Brown is someone who I think about in terms of this Bengals offense and what it could be in the future as well. This is kind of one of those picks where he could perform for you this season as well, but also might be someone you might want to look for in the future, potentially in dynasty leagues even, because he's a young guy with a lot of talent, a lot of raw potential, and if the Bengals do decide to retool this offseason, might become one of the faces of this franchise as well. So that's why he intrigues me so much in terms of his value, not just for this season, but beyond as well. And I always love talking about guys who you might want to look into for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of fantasy as well, because it's always nice to have someone in the back of your mind to monitor throughout your own fantasy journey as well. And last but not least, another guy from Jacksonville who has no choice but to step up in Parker Washington. Going to have a much bigger role, did have a much bigger role in that game against Houston this weekend. But I feel like this is definitely a gimme kind of pick here because of the fact, the Jacksonville Jaguars have been decimated at the receiver position. And I think that's kind of a weird situation there where, all these receivers are going down and everyone's blaming Trevor. But now Trevor's hurt, and now all these different external issues are coming to light yet again for Jacksonville. I mean, they've been kind of the underlying theme of Jacksonville's season, but they've not been the problem. And I think the receiver issue has been one of them that hasn't been talked about enough. Christian Kirk was injured mid-season. Gabe Davis was injured early in the season. And now you're left with, if you're Mac Jones, a guy in Parker Washington. But I like this guy. He's physical, second-year player out of Penn State. And I really think that he showed that he's willing to step up. Maybe not the most explosive of players in that offense outside of, Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby. But still a reliable pair of hands for a team wanting to see which players are worth investing. Because at the end of the day, a guy like Christian Kirk or a guy like Gabe Davis is not necessarily going to be worth investing your time into as they age out. Parker Washington's a young guy wanting to prove himself, so look for him to stand up. Let me know what you think about the waiver wire in the comments, as Andre did, because it's a very interesting situation as we head to the concluding weeks of the season. But coming next, we continue with our positional rankings with the most volatile position of all in fantasy, the wide receiver position. You definitely don't want to miss it. We'll be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we continue with our positional rankings as always with the wide receiver position, which, like I said, is going to be one of the most volatile positions in all of fantasy football this year. And I feel like the reason why I say this is because we know of all the superstar talents and depth of this position, right? But we don't know week in, week out how it will affect our view of them. Because we've seen certain situations in which, superstars are either not looked at as often or are either aberrations on their team or just plain out disappointing. That's the fun of this position, right? Because then you have to dig deeper into the position and you find guys that you never would expect to really stand out at the wide receiver position in fantasy, but now are really coveted assets. And so that's why I feel like this week's ranking, I decided to look at a lot of stars, but also look at a certain player who actually had a great game last night, and we talked about it earlier in the show, spoiler alert, but still are guys who can vacillate between different positions, right? They're not always going to be at the top every week, and it's an understanding between, fantasy football managers, I guess, and the fact that the market's so volatile. Without further ado, let's jump right into the wide receivers who, no shocker here, are all going to be superstars from here on out. Starting off with a big one, really helping his team after returning from injury. Mike Evans against the Raiders. How timely was he against Carolina in that shockingly close game? A really opportunistic guy. Again, he's not necessarily a quote-unquote superstar, but in terms of fantasy, he's probably one of everyone's favorite receivers because of the fact he gets the job done year in, year out. Consistent. Paragon of consistency at the position. 25.8 fantasy points against Carolina, going up against the Raiders, who are basically playing out the season right now. I don't know what's going on with them, even though they play with passion against the Chiefs. It's a weird situation there in Las Vegas. And while I credit the defense for all its players, it's certainly one that could have used Christian Wilkins right about now. And even though they held the Chiefs to 19 points, well, the Chiefs have been declining as well. So look for the Bucs playing with a lot of passion coming into this one, trying to win the NFC South outright, to make a statement and say, we're not going to be overwhelmed by a quote-unquote cupcake game. We're not going to succumb to that. We're going to overcome it because we have one of the most consistent receivers in the league, and he's going to prove why, much like he did against Carolina in that semi-trap game as well. So look for Mike Evans to continue to be consistent, because consistency is key at the wide receiver position for a lot of these players. And then let's talk about Jerry Jeudy. Yet again, my second player who I want to spotlight here. I love talking about Jerry Jeudy, because think about his career, right? In Denver, right? Not necessarily seen as a guy who was going to have a defined role, right? He was either going to be a solid route runner or a deep threat, and he never really had a defined role. And maybe that's due to Sean Payton. Maybe that's due to the frustrations of the Russell Wilson era there, but never really gotten a chance to prove what he can be in a standout system. Then moved to Cleveland, right? Thought to be able to fix a lot of the Browns' issues in the receiving game, right? Start as their wide receiver one. Then the start of the season comes and Deshaun Watson disappoints, and Jerry Jeudy disappoints as well because Deshaun Watson's not targeting him. Deshaun Watson goes down, Jameis Winston comes in, and suddenly Jerry Jeudy has looked like one of the best receivers in the league over the past 4 weeks. And last night proved it against his former team, in front of Sean Payton, proving that he can be a wide receiver one. And again, this is going to be a tough matchup as they're facing the Steelers the second time in 3 weeks, much like my Hawks will be against the Cardinals, but I digress. This is going to be an interesting matchup because now both teams know how physical each other can get. And this is the AFC North we're talking about. Nothing comes easy, even a game against the division bottom feeder. So look for Jerry Jeudy, much like how he played in that first Pittsburgh game, to be timely opportunistic. Maybe not 235 yards opportunistic, but still effective enough to say, I want to start him again and again and again because of what he means to this offense now that Jameis Winston is at the helm. Because looking at it, when you give him a guy at the quarterback position who's willing to throw him the football, he's willing to play as hard as they do. And we've seen that with him and Jameis. And so that's why Jerry Jeudy, yes, he's frustrating, but in certain situations, not entirely his fault. So give him a guy like Jameis Winston, he can light somebody up, even if it's a division rival who now knows how tough you can perform against them. So look for him to have a repeat performance, maybe not Denver Broncos-like performance, but first Pittsburgh Steelers game importance, as I think the Browns will also try and shock them again. Then the third guy I want to talk about is another superstar who we also touched upon a little bit before, Justin Jefferson. I had another kind of revenge game as the Vikings are going to be facing their former quarterback in Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. And this team, the Atlanta Falcons, has no direction right now. Kirk Cousins is playing the worst football of his NFL career. 6 interceptions to 0 touchdowns in these past 3 games. Absolutely atrocious. And we already know what I think about this pass defense. AJ Terrell, yes, I love him. Yes, he's been one of the best cornerbacks in the league, faced the top receivers in the league, guys like Devontae Smith, Mike Evans, George Pickens, DK Metcalf, and locked them up. But he's an aberration. This is a terrible pass defense, no matter how you slice it. And yes, this is an opportunity for us to see the wealth of weapons that the Vikings have, the depth they have at each position in the offense. But Justin Jefferson's really going to be foaming at the mouth to really attack this Falcons defense, because very rarely do you get a chance to go up against your former teammate, go up against a defense. You'll be facing their top guy, yes, but you know how bad they are, and just showing up and showing out and wanting to humiliate them. This could be very ugly for this Falcons pass defense, especially if Justin Jefferson is willing to attack AJ Terrell, as so few receivers have. That's why I feel like Justin Jefferson, even in a situation in which you feel like he's not necessarily going to have the biggest of games, he is still someone who really diversifies this Vikings offense. You have to account for him at every single turn. You have to be aware of what he can do in terms of opening things up underneath or over the top for his teammates. So while he certainly is a product of his environment and he has to play within the confines of his system sometimes, this is an opportunity against this poor pass defense to really prove why he's a superstar, not just because of how you have to account for him, but because you also have to worry about him wreaking havoc on your defense. And that's something the Falcons have known for far too long this season, how bad their defense is. So look for Justin Jefferson with 16.9 fantasy points against Arizona. Not necessarily the best of performances for him against that Arizona defense, but still a timely performance. Like I said, sometimes the wide receiver position is not necessarily about superstar production. It's about timeliness and opportunism. And Justin Jefferson is that to a T this season. He's been very helpful to Sam Darnold, but he hasn't necessarily been someone who is going to be targeted as much. But that also proves how much of a superstar he really is, because of the fact his team can still underutilize him sometimes, and he makes his presence felt in these games. So that's why you have to look out for Justin Jefferson. And last but not least, this is a guy who also I feel kind of sorry for as a superstar receiver, Jamar Chase. It's not his fault that the Bengals are out of the playoff picture. It's not his fault, he is not extended for the Cincinnati Bengals. It's not his fault that they now have more questions than answers right now with the Cincinnati Bengals. But he still is one of the better fantasy wide receivers in the National Football League right now. 20.6 fantasy points versus Pittsburgh in that very weird shootout game. But I do think that this matchup against the Cowboys, against two teams that surprisingly have starkly different records, or similar records. In fact, I do believe that the Bengals actually have the worst record in this matchup, if you can believe that. And in this matchup of offense versus defense, where you're seeing the steady improvement of the Cowboys defense and how it could match up against a guy like Jamar Chase, I think it's going to come down to the effectiveness of the momentum that this offense has built. Because it doesn't necessarily matter if your defense sucks. If your offense is good, your offense is good. And I could care less, if the Bengals win this game. I know it sounds harsh, but it doesn't even matter right now at this point because they're not going to make the playoffs. But Jamar Chase is still someone you always have to look out for no matter how bad his team is. Just because you know the momentum that this Bengals offense can build. They've had their bad moments, right? They've had certain foibles that they have to fix in the offseason. But at the end of the day, this is still one of the better NFL offenses. And so a guy like Jamar Chase is always going to have the opportunity to have impressive games for you. Now, I know that right now you might be looking more at guys down the ladder a little bit, down the rung a little bit. And all of these guys have been playing like superstars. Even Jerry Jeudy right now could be considered a top 10 wide receiver at this very moment. But when I think about the outlook of this wide receiver position down the stretch and guys who will really matter, these are the guys or some of the top guys who I feel like will have a say in the fantasy playoffs a lot more than the bad teams as well. Because even though the waiver wire is definitely going to be important, you're definitely going to want to bolster your squad. And it's always fun to look at the bad teams and how these fill-in players really stand out. But you also need to be aware of these superstars. Because the superstars at the end of the day are the ones who are going to make their own playoffs. These are the guys who are going to be seeing into later months. You're going to be seeing them in January. You're going to be seeing them potentially in February. And so that's why these lists are going to start to become a little bit more superstar heavy. I still respect all of these receivers this year who've made a name for themselves, whether they're more waiver wire guys or been sneaking under the radar. All of them merit consideration for your rosters. And I love talking about the underdog. But it just feels pretty apt right now, assessing this position and its volatility, to stick with my guns and say the superstars are the way forward, even though I kind of denied that sentiment in my waiver wire segment. But at the end of the day, it's up to you to determine how you really decipher this position and the last minute decisions you might want to make about your roster. This is more about me looking at the bigger picture of this position, not necessarily pinpointing down the line and analyzing certain players. This is me saying, stick with your guns if you feel it's right. But let me know what you think about this in the comments, because coming up next we go to the next position, my tight ends. I love talking about this position, perhaps my favorite positional rankings of the week, so you definitely don't want to miss it when we come back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and for our fourth segment of the day, like I said, perhaps my favorite positional rankings to do is the tight end position. I love this position because it's been a lot weirder than I could have ever expected and you guys could have ever expected, just because I thought there was going to be a clear delineation between generations. The younger guys were going to start to emerge and the older guys were going to start to tire out a little bit. And while we've seen a little bit of that, we've seen a lot more unsung heroes actually step up no matter their age. Whether it be surprising candidates on contending teams or just guys who haven't really gone under their radar throughout the years and are finally shutting their stuff. This position has been just super fun to analyze, and it could prove to be one of the more important positions down the stretch for you. Because, like I said, tight ends have never been the sexiest of fantasy positions. Let me be clear here. Now they're finally having their chance in the sun, and even though it's been a very weird tight end season statistically, there are still a lot of guys who you're going to value for years to come. Maybe not for as long as you think, because there still is that generational divide, but there's a lot more fun ways to analyze this position now that we see a wide amalgamation of players now stepping up for their respective teams. This list truly proves that the tight end position could run the gamut in terms of what people think of it week in, week out. No clear number one tight end stands out in my mind right now. It could have been Sam Laporta, it could have been Travis Kelce, it could have been George Kittle, it could have been anyone at the top. But I can't really say that any one tight end stands out. That's what makes it so special. So as always, let's get into my favorite positional rankings of the weekend, my tight ends. Starting off with a guy who really speaks to this kind of unsung hero on a contending team, which has really stood out this season. One of my favorite tight ends to watch this year in Tucker Kraft. He is a very annoying player, granted, if you don't like the Packers, which I happen to do. But he is still someone who is really exceptional at everything you want out of a tight end. He's physical, he can block, he's a nightmare in the red zone, and most importantly, has an impressive catch radius. A lot of these tight ends need to have pretty impressive catch radii to really stand out in the National Football League, because that's the evolution of the position, right? You can't just be in your one little box. You can't either be a pass-catching tight end or a blocking tight end anymore. We've seen it in the development of certain tight ends. And Tucker Kraft really fits the bill here in terms of how a tight end can evolve. And so that's why, against the Lions, in a very tough matchup, perhaps the toughest matchup out of any tight end in the league, I think it's going to stand out, especially if the Lions can sustain drives. 13.8 fantasy points against Miami. Definitely not his best performance, but certainly one that shows they can be consistent in terms of staying at the bar set for tight ends. Kind of that point tally that you really want your tight ends to hit. He's not necessarily going to be the superstar, like I said, for you, but he's been a paragon of consistency at the position, and he's proven that he can develop his skills enough to really stand out for Green Bay this year. Now let's talk about another guy who's been around the block a little bit. We know about this guy. I feel like he's starting to become a little bit more popular in fantasy circles and has really proven his worth to this football team. He's not necessarily, a traits guy. He's just a kind of all-around toolsy kind of position player. But at the end of the day, he gets the job done, unlike many other kind of mid-tier tight ends. And he's really differentiated himself from that mid-tier of age group as well. He's kind of in his middle age, kind of not over the hill yet, but not necessarily a young buck. This guy has just been someone who I'm glad to see finally get his day in the sun. And that is Dallas Goedert, going up against the Panthers in what could be a surprisingly interesting matchup now. 12.5 fantasy points against Baltimore, but for perhaps one of the best teams in the NFC and the entire NFL, this is a guy you don't want to see get hot if you're contending for a playoff position. Because Dallas Goedert is someone who really is frustrating to stop if the Eagles' offense is already beating you up. Because as much as it's frustrating to get beat up by Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley and A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, imagine the physicality of Dallas Goedert also having a say in your game. And so that's why Dallas Goedert, even though, like I say, he's not necessarily the best in terms of getting touches and target share in this very versatile offense, but in certain matchups down the stretch, maybe not so much in the postseason just because, the Eagles are going to try to impose their will a little bit more and they're going to lean heavily into Saquon down the stretch there. But for now, for the rest of the regular season, Dallas Goedert is going to be an X factor for them. And he's going to be a menace, a nightmare for teams trying to take the Eagles down a notch here. And so that's why I feel like the Eagles are such a scary team outside of their top four weapons. Because Dallas Goedert is someone that's been around the block, an experienced player. He can play the position any way you need him to. And either stand out and have a stellar receiving performance or just do his job really well and go understated in terms of performances. And that's what you really want out of a tight end, don't you? Maybe it's not as exciting from a fantasy standpoint, but it's certainly something that I'm liking in seeing a lot of these tight ends because of the fact versatility matters to them. No matter what you need to do to have success on a certain play, you do it. And Dallas Goedert is the epitome of that statement. And another guy who's kind of more in the surprising category, a guy who's really come on these past couple of weeks, maybe not going to have as much importance in the postseason as well because his team might not even make it, but still a very fun player to watch this past couple of weeks and really fun to monitor from a fantasy standpoint as well. How about Jonnu Smith? One of the more relevant Dolphins tight ends since Mike Gesicki was there. 21.3 fantasy points against Green Bay. Continuing with a shock in an offense rife with talent. This isn't an offense in which, a tight end going off would be ordinary. This is an offense that includes one of the better 1-2 punches at the wide receiver position in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and a pretty solid backfield with Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert, Jalen Wright back there. This is an offense that has its top receiver consistently be a tight end as they're trying to make a playoff. But Jonnu Smith has proven his value to this team. And I always viewed Jonnu Smith as one of those weird players who always pops up now and again, never really standing out in his position, but now he's really proven that he can be one of those inline route running type tight ends who can use his yards after catch ability to generate a lot of production. And I think that's what the Dolphins love about him, because they're all about speed. They're all about breakaway gains, and that's what Jonnu Smith kind of brings to the table. He's not the speediest player on this team, but he is one of the more effective ones over the past couple of weeks, and most importantly, very efficient when his name is called, because he doesn't let this offense down, doesn't put them behind the sticks. He, in fact, moves the chains in more ways than one, and can do it in a way that the Dolphins appreciate, most importantly. And he's not necessarily someone who is going to potentially have a long run with any one team. Maybe he does sign a contract extension with the Dolphins. Maybe he does like it there. Maybe he continues to be one of the more consistent performers in this offense. But for now, just enjoy the ride while you can with him, because this is a guy who a lot of people might have found on waivers, or a lot of people might have wrote off. But these past couple of weeks, now that you know the Dolphins are going to try their best to be competitive down the stretch, even if they don't make the playoffs, Jonnu Smith has been a revelation, and he could continue to be. Maybe next season he's going to be in a different uniform, in a different situation, or he's going to be right back here and he'll return to his mortal self. But for now, I'm really high on Jonnu Smith. And against a divisional opponent that's reeling right now, look for him to compound their misery. So that's why I think Jonnu Smith definitely merits consideration for the rest of the season. And the last guy I'm going to talk about could have been one of the top tight ends at the position this year. Injury woes a little bit. In fact, injury woes this recent game against the 49ers hindered him from playing, but should be back healthy next week. And the guy who I really want to see stand out over these next couple of weeks I still believe he is on my personal fantasy team, and I would love to have him back because I'm kind of reeling right now. It could be one of those saving graces down the stretch for me. It's Dalton Kincaid. If this guy plays for the Buffalo Bills, this is your Super Bowl winner. I'm going to say it now. If Dalton Kincaid comes back, stays healthy for the rest of the year, this team is the Super Bowl winner. Because Dalton Kincaid, to me, looks to be the most complete tight end in the NFL. And I don't say that lightly, because when I look at this Bills offense and look at how versatile it has become from where it was when it was very stagnant with Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen trying to win the game with big pass plays to now, Dalton Kincaid truly means a lot to this team. They've not suffered without him, right? But when they're with him, they could blow people away. They could knock the doors down in the AFC. That's how special this kid is. And that's why I'm hoping that when he comes back, the Bills really utilize him. It's going to be a bit risky because he is very injury prone. And I know that, myself included, a lot of people would be ticked off if he continues to get injured throughout the season and is not effective in the postseason. But I feel like once he comes back, you can't deny his abilities at the tight end position. Could have been the tight end one, in my opinion, had he played the whole season. Against the Rams, if he does come back, look out, because that one could get ugly. In potential trap game, if Dalton Kincaid is there, it could make a huge difference. Let me know what you think in the comments. This is the end of our traditional positional rankings. I'm going to do my defense and special teams tomorrow, but this concludes my positional rankings portion of the show, and we conclude today's show with a fantasy fact versus fiction segment. I love doing this segment of justifying or debunking fantasy myths that could stand out this week. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network for a final segment of today's show. And it's a little fun one as always to conclude these early shows here in the week. My fantasy fact versus fiction segment yesterday, I did my Don't Be Surprised If segment where I make several bold fantasy claims to kind of monitor throughout the weekend in fantasy football. Now I'm going to make some more claims and either justify or debunk them for you, because I feel a lot of interesting matchups are taking place as we get later and later into the season. A lot of interesting storylines about certain players. Will they or won't they in certain situations? Which teams really stand out? Which matchups really pop on paper, potentially from a fantasy standpoint. So I really love adding this segment to the show because it just makes you think a little bit more about certain decisions you want to make down the stretch for your fantasy squad, no matter where you are on the table. And so that's why I feel like I have this segment, have to have some fun with it, and as always, it's a pleasure to do to conclude the Tuesday shows. Without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with a guy who I'm all too familiar with. I love talking about this guy. Starting to become a true potential wide receiver 1 for this Seattle offense. He's outpacing DK Metcalf, clearly usurped Tyler Lockett as at least the wide receiver 2, and potentially Geno's favorite read down the field, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And I think that a big storyline to follow here is how high can this kid go? How high is his ceiling for the rest of the season? Can he usurp even DK Metcalf as the number 1 option there in Seattle? And the thing that I came up with was, can he continue this fantasy hot streak even? Because a lot of people invested a lot into him, truly thinking of him as a potential breakout star in this campaign. At the start of the season, it didn't look that way, but now he truly is. And the take that I come up with is JSN continuing this fantasy hot streak, but however, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, I'm coming to you and saying, at least for this weekend, no. I think this is going to be fiction here. And the reason why I think this is, at least for this weekend at the very least, is because when you look at these NFC West matchups, very little separates this team. When you look at other divisional rivalries around the league, you're starting to see a vast separation, right? Some of them are still feisty. Some of them are still important. I'm not saying or indicting any one division or one divisional matchup here. But in the NFC West, it's going to start to get a lot tighter just because of the logjam in this division. And when I look at this matchup, especially between the Seahawks and Cardinals, second time in 3 weeks, and what Seattle's travel has looked like, and the way they had to go over to New York, have that emotional game, fly back to Arizona, it's going to mess with them a little bit. I don't necessarily think it will take them out of this game entirely. I think it's still going to be a close game, but it's not going to be offense-driven, much like that last game was. So that's why I feel like JSN, at least in this matchup, is not going to stand out. Maybe he will, and maybe I'll look silly because someone's going to have to be the difference in this matchup here. But I do think that in this game, now the Cardinals know potentially the pass plays that Geno and JSN are comfortable playing with, I think that his stats are going to diminish, at least for this week alone. Potentially, this could change the fact after this game, down the stretch, when they're playing tougher games. But for now, I'm going to say fiction for this week in terms of the JSN hot streak continuing. Then, the next one, this one is kind of a silly one, but I always like to throw at least one long shot out there. Aaron Rodgers potentially being a fantasy sleeper against the Dolphins. Should he start? Because it kind of is up in the air about his status to start. I think Ulbrich is confident in him at the time, right now, the time being, but it could change throughout the week because I'm truly not sure what Aaron Rodgers really is in this offense. As Tap to Learn said, Rams will get it done. Experience, coach, and roster will prevail. I believe he's actually talking about the NFC West title rather than, just any one game in the division. I completely disagree. The Seahawks have all the momentum. They may not have the easiest schedule, but that defense can match up against any offense and completely shut them down. They did it for 3 weeks running, and this is not a biased opinion. I'm seeing with my own eyes. After the hectic nature of that first half where they could have been taken out of the game, that defense locked down that Jets offense from the 7:39 mark of the second quarter to the end of the game. And I don't necessarily think, the Rams right now are in a position where I feel like down the stretch, they're going to differentiate themselves from people. They've been pretty middling throughout the season. Yes, they have the important tiebreakers in the division should it come down to that. But I do think the Rams, the problem is I can't really see any consistency in this team. They have a tough matchup against the defense. As Tap to Learn says, McDonald is shaky. I'm not necessarily certain. Oh, Mike McDonald. Well, here's the thing I'll say about Mike McDonald. He might not be the best coach, but he's changed the culture a lot there in Seattle. He's really keeping the squad accountable, and I really think that that's mattered a lot in the development of the squad from where they were to start the season. And not now. As Tap to Learn always says, Cards D may make some noise. Well, if the Seahawks defense will make some noise, it doesn't matter. Because I think the Seahawks offense, as bad as some areas of it are, and some aspects of it are, I think it's opportunistic enough to put up enough points to where the defense can shut down a team. And even when they're losing, and their offense isn't necessarily clicking, the defense can do enough to be able to keep them in that game. And that's why Seattle is such an interesting team in terms of their contender status in the division, potentially in the playoffs, because of the fact they're a very opportunistic squad. They're not necessarily good in one area, but they're not too bad or awful in one area. Potentially their offensive line will come back to bite them, but they're not necessarily that awful in any one area either. So that's why I think they stand out in this division as someone who's managed to find consistency in certain games. As he also acknowledges, only one team coming out of the West, no wildcards emerging. That I completely agree with you. It's going to come down to who wins this division, and it's going to be the team that can remain consistent. So far it's been Seattle. That could change, and I appreciate you mentioning other teams' strengths. But I do think that for time being, until Seattle proves otherwise, they right now are the best team in the NFC West at this current moment in time. Getting back to Aaron Rodgers here, yeah, I don't necessarily think this one's coming true, and I did say it was fact, but here's the reason why it could potentially still have merit. This Dolphins team could get caught up in itself a little bit out of that demoralizing loss to Green Bay that kind of could have kept them in the playoff picture had they won, but still, it would have been a tough sledding situation for them down the stretch. But I do feel like, they're just small details away in that Jets offense from finding some modicum of consistency. In that game, it's not like, the receivers were frustrating Rodgers. Rodgers was more frustrating himself. If he can get a little bit of consistency, if he can rely on that run game most importantly, because that can really help him settle down, then potentially we can start to see him click a little bit more with his receivers, get on the same page as them. Because that's been the problem. Rodgers has been getting in his own way, getting in his own head, because age is catching up to him. But now it's going to come down to just trying to get that out of his mind. Trying to focus on the team and try and focus on this connectivity to it as well. So that's why Aaron Rodgers, I still have some hope that at least for one game, he could potentially be a fantasy star for you. But I think a lot of people have given up on him anyways, and I wouldn't be mad if this doesn't come true, because it shouldn't, because of how bad he's been. But for now, I'm just trying to justify it a little bit so that I don't look too bad here. But I still think in this matchup, anything can happen in that division. Now, the third one I want to talk about is kind of a surprise, but I can see this one actually potentially proving me wrong. Bryce Young and Jalen Hurts being the top QBs of the week. I say this is fiction, but the reason why, it's not too far-fetched that this could happen is because I truly believe this QB matchup is more even than we think. Bryce Young has played his behind off ever since being benched and coming back after that Andy Dalton situation. Whereas Jalen Hurts, he's been fantastic, but I still believe that what brings him kind of to, not necessarily fully to Bryce's level, because I do think Jalen Hurts is a better quarterback, but his passing prowess is not necessarily improved as much as I would have liked to see it this season. That's what makes this a little bit more of an interesting situation. As Tap to Learn says, back to the West, Cards' schedule very favorable. Seahawks have to run the gauntlet. Cards, Vikes, Pack, Rams. Let's be clear here. The Seahawks may only have to win one or two of those games, and it may have to just be those division games. They can lose to all three of the Vikings, Packers, and the Bears, and it wouldn't matter, because if you win in your division, chances are the other teams won't win with you. You'd have every single tiebreaker if you just beat the Cards and the Rams. Yes, you're going to have to see how the Cardinals' schedule breaks out. But if Seattle takes care of business in the division, I think they can win this division with just 8 or 9 wins. That's how weird this division truly is. And so that's why I feel like I can't really buy into the teams behind Seattle yet, because they haven't proven they can separate as Seattle has. And especially in the division, because Seattle now has wins over the 49ers and Cardinals. Could have 2 wins over the Cardinals in that tiebreaker. And that matters, because it's much better to be 8-5 and with 2 important divisional wins, with one potentially to clinch the division in the final week of the season, than to have a losing record at that point and have a negative tiebreaker against you when you're going up head-to-head against Seattle at the end of the season. And while he's saying the Cards have the Pats and Panthers and 49ers, what's to say the Cardinals can't slip up? Because I really don't know what to make of that team. So that's the reason being. The final one I want to do is Kirk Cousins proving that he's a bust in terms of his former team here. And that's a fact here. I don't necessarily think Kirk Cousins has any hope in this matchup if he does start even for the Falcons against his former team. That Vikings team, yes, they don't generate takeaways as much, but they are a very aggressive defense. They're going to be generating a heck of a lot of pressure on a still pretty hobbled and quote-unquote sedentary Kirk Cousins here, if you know what I mean. And so that's why I feel like that's going to happen. But let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. Thank you for the NFC West talk. I still think Seattle could win this division. But other than that, this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. You know what to do in terms of subscribing to the show, liking, following it, and using these different features here on YouTube to really contribute to interact with the show. But other than that, I am out for today.